Now I personally have a lot of plans, but not a lot of time. For instance, I want to build this YouTube channel, I have plans to create a web shop, I want to read more, I want to become a better programmer, I want to get in better shape. So basically too many goals, but not enough time. Now let's get more concrete and let's pick this YouTube channel as an example. So I tried to build this YouTube channel and my initial goal was to post a video every 2 weeks. Now I'm still learning this whole video creation stuff and hopefully each video gets better and better. However, I still have my day-to-day job as a software developer, plus I have all these other goals that I previously mentioned. So in reality it takes me way longer than 2 weeks to create a video. Now as a result, eventually I lost my motivation and instead of working on those videos, bad habits creep in. Now I didn't really understand why this was happening, but then I read this book, Atomic Habits, written by James Clear. James describes that many people begin the process of changing their habits by focusing on what they want to achieve. And this is exactly what I did, because I was really goal oriented, so I wanted to post a video every 2 weeks. Now the problem with this goal oriented mindset is that it restricts happiness, because I was teaching myself to only be happy once I finished another video. Now as a result, I didn't enjoy this whole video creation process anymore. So even though I was making progress in the right direction, I was working on those videos every week, I was still losing motivation. Now James argues that too often we convince ourselves that massive success requires massive action. But changes that seem small and unimportant at first will compound into remarkable results if you are willing to stick with them for years. So here's how the math works out. If you can get 1% better each day for 1 year, you'll end up 37 times better by the time you're done. Or in other words, it are these tiny habits that matter and can compound into remarkable results in the long run. Now you don't do this by focusing on goals, you do this by focusing on the system. James explains that a goal-oriented mindset can create a yo-yo effect. So how does this work? Well, in the book there is a nice analogy about runners. Many runners work hard for months, but as soon as they cross the finish line, they stop training. The race is no longer there to motivate them. When all of your hard work is focused on a particular goal, what is left to push you forward after you achieve it? This is why many people find themselves reverting to their old habits after accomplishing a goal. The purpose of setting goals is to win the game. The purpose of building systems is to continue playing the game. So to remember, goals are good for setting a direction, but systems are best for making progress. Now let's zoom in a bit deeper. James describes 3 layers of behavior chains. The first layer is outcome chains. In this layer we focus on goals. So what we want to achieve. Things like losing weight, a successful YouTube channel, or getting a programming job. The second layer is process chains. Now here we more or less focus on what we do, like implementing a workout routine, developing a daily reading habit, or developing a meditation practice. The third and last layer is identity chains. With this approach we start focusing on who we wish to become. So your goal should not be to read more books, but to become a reader. Or in my specific example, my goal should not be to create a video every 2 weeks, but to become a content creator or YouTuber or however you want to call it. Now this identity layer is the most effective layer, because you are not really motivating yourself to do a specific habit. You are more like, this is just who I am. So the idea behind it is that when a habit becomes part of your identity, your behaviors will naturally change. James describes that improvements are only temporary until they become part of who you are. So how do we change our identity? Well, James explains that this is a simple 2-step process. First, decide the type of person that you want to be, and then secondly, prove it to yourself with small wins. For instance, you want to become a programmer, then every time you write a line of code, you are a programmer. Or you want to become a writer, then each time you write a page, you are a writer. Your habits shape your identity, and your identity shapes your habits. It's a two-way street. James Clear. Now, unfortunately, changing your habits can still be challenging. So let's take a step back. In this book, a habit is defined as a routine or behavior that is performed regularly and in many cases automatically. For instance, brushing your teeth before bed or tying your shoes. Here are things that pretty much go on autopilot. So how are these habits formed? Well, James explains that there are actually 4 stages that every habit goes through. And your brain runs through these steps every time, and also in the same order. The first stage is the cue. Habits begin with a cue, or some type of raw data. Basically anything that gets your attention. For instance, you smell the fresh aroma of coffee when walking down the street through work. Now this cue naturally triggers a craving. A craving is the motivational force behind every habit. For instance, you begin to crave for coffee. Now this craving motivates a response. And the response is the actual habit you perform. For instance, you buy a fresh cup of coffee. Now eventually, this response leads to a reward. Rewards are the end goal of every habit. For instance, you satisfy your craving by taking a sip of your nice cup of coffee. This cycle is known as the habit loop. The more you repeat a habit loop, the stronger and more automatic they become. For instance, if I buy a coffee every time I walk to work, then eventually this becomes a habit that I will pretty much do on autopilot. I mean, as described by James, most of us never give a second thought to the fact that we tie the same shoe first each morning, or unplug the toaster after each use, or always change into comfortable clothes after getting home from work. After decades of mental programming, we automatically slip into these patterns of thinking. Now, these habit loops can of course result into good habits, but also into bad habits, especially because most habits go on autopilot. So how can we influence the habit loop to make it work for us? Well, in this book, James explains 4 laws to influence the habit loop. Most habits are so automatic that you don't even realize them. I mean, as James describes, over time the cues that spark our habits become so common that they are essentially invisible. The treats on the kitchen counter, the remote control next to the couch, the phone in our pocket. Our responses to these cues are so deeply encoded that it may feel like the urge to act comes from nowhere. So the more automatic a behavior becomes, the less likely we are to consciously think about it. For this reason, James argues that many of our failures in performance are largely attributable to a lack of self-awareness. I mean, how can you change your habits if you aren't aware of them? So James suggests to become aware of your daily habits, you need to create a habit scorecard. This basically means that you make a list of your daily habits. Once you have a full list, look at each behavior and ask yourself, is this a good habit, a bad habit, or a neutral habit? If it is a good habit, write a plus sign next to it. If it is a bad habit, write a minus sign next to it. If it is a neutral habit, write an equal sign next to it. Now the goal is to simply be aware of your daily habits. As James describes, the process of behavior change always starts with awareness. So once we are aware of our habits, how do we start a new habit? Hundreds of studies have shown that people who make a specific plan for when and where they will perform a new habit are more likely to follow through. For instance, we tell ourselves, I'm going to eat healthier, or I'm going to read more, but we never say when and where these habits are going to happen. Now, the simplest way to apply this strategy to your habits is to fill out this sentence. I will behavior at time in location. For instance, I will read a book for 30 minutes daily at 9 o'clock in the evening in the bedroom. This is called implementation intention. James explains that once an implementation intention has been set, you don't have to wait for inspiration to strike. So you don't have to think about things like, do I read today or not? There's no need to make a decision, you just simply follow your predetermined plan. Another way to get a new habit started is by applying a concept called habit stacking. With habit stacking, you identify a current habit that you already do each day and you stack a new behavior on top of it. Now the habit stacking formula is after current habit, I will new habit. For instance, after I close my laptop for lunch, I will first do a 15 minutes Wim Hof breathing exercise. Habit stacking increases the likelihood that you'll stick with a habit by stacking your new behavior on top of an old one. Now, a tip: you can use your habit scorecard to find the right trigger for your habit stacking. Next to this, James explains that our motivation is highly overrated. We are more influenced by our environment than by our motivation. James describes that environment is the invisible hand that shapes human behavior. Despite our unique personalities, certain behaviors tend to arise again and again under certain environmental conditions. Or in other words, we are changed by the world around us. Every habit is context dependent. For instance, the more obviously available a product or service is, the more likely you are to try it. So how do you design your environment for success? Now this is pretty simple. If you want to make a habit a big part of your life, then make the cue a big part of your environment. So want to read more? Place the book you read somewhere you can see it. Now this also applies the other way around. One of the most practical ways to eliminate a bad habit is by removing the cue that triggers it. I mean, as described in the book, remove a single cue and a habit often fades away. This is the secret of self-control. So important to remember, make the cues of your good habits obvious and make the cues of your bad habits invisible. Over time, your habits become associated not with a single trigger, but with the entire context surrounding the behavior. Now James describes a nice example. Many people drink more in social situations than they would ever drink alone. The trigger is rarely a single cue, but rather the whole situation. For instance, watching your friends order drinks, hearing the music at the bar, and seeing the beers on tap. We mentally assign our habits to the locations in which they occur. The home, the office, the gym. And each location develops a connection to certain habits and routines. For instance, in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, with all the lockdowns and stuff, I mainly worked from home. At first, I did everything in the living room. I worked there, I eat there, I relaxed there, I studied there. Now, there was no clear division between the end of work time and the beginning of personal time. I did everything in the same place. This made it difficult for me to turn off the working side of my brain, but also the other way around. In the end, I started feeling a bit depressed. So I created a separate working space. In here I do my job, I create my YouTube videos, I study, etc. And in the living room I chill. As described by James, whenever possible, avoid mixing the context of one habit with another. When you start mixing context, you'll start mixing habits. And the easier ones usually win out. Alright, now the second law of behavior change is make it attractive. As James describes, the more attractive an opportunity, the more likely it is to become habit forming. So the goal of this second law is to learn how to make habits more attractive. But first we begin by shortly looking into a neurotransmitter called dopamine. In short, dopamine plays a role in the science of motivation. Now, high levels of dopamine increases our motivation, which allows us to act faster. In contrast, low levels of dopamine can leave us feeling unmotivated, so the likelihood to act decreases. For years, scientists assumed dopamine was all about pleasure, but now we know it plays a central role in many neurological processes, including motivation, learning and memory, punishment and aversion, and voluntary movement. When it comes to habits, the key takeaway is this: dopamine is released not only when you experience pleasure, but also when you anticipate it. For instance, gambling addicts have a dopamine spike right before they place a bet, not after they win. So whenever you predict that an opportunity will be rewarding, your levels of dopamine spike in anticipation. And whenever dopamine rises, so does your motivation to act. We need to make our habits attractive because it is the expectation of a rewarding experience that motivates us to act in the first place. Now, how do we make our habits more attractive? Well, one way to do this is by something called temptation bundling. With temptation bundling, you can bundle or pair an action that you need to do with an action that you want to do. For instance, you can bundle watching Netflix, an action that you want to do, with working out, an action that you need to do. I also bundle cooking, something I need to do, with listening to a podcast, something I want to do. Now, the idea behind it is that you are more likely to find a behavior attractive if you can do one of your favorite things at the same time. Secondly, one of the most effective things that you can do is to join a culture where your desired behavior is the normal behavior. I mean, as James describes, we want to fit in, to bond with others, and to earn the respect and approval of peers. One of the deepest human desires is to belong. If you want to read more books, join a book club. Do you want to become a musician? Join a band. Thirdly, you can make hard habits more attractive if you can learn to associate them with a positive experience. For instance, many people associate exercise with a challenging task that drains your energy. You can also associate exercise with health and well-being. Saving money can be associated with sacrifice. You can also associate it with future financial freedom. Now, this is a small shift in your mindset that can make hard habits more attractive. Alright, so the third law, make it easy. The more you repeat a behavior, the more automatic it becomes. But how does this work? Well, the more you repeat an activity, the more the structure of your brain changes to become efficient at that activity. So in short, your brain eventually changes during repetition. For instance, when scientists analyzed the brain of taxi drivers in London, they found that the hippocampus, a region of the brain involved in spatial memory, was significantly larger in taxi drivers than in non-taxi drivers. Now, when a taxi driver retired, they saw that the hippocampus decreases in size. So, moral of this story, when you repeat a behavior, your brain changes, so it becomes more efficient at doing that activity. Now, the more efficient an activity becomes, the higher the probability that it becomes more automatic. Or in other words, you just need to get your reps in, and the most effective way to do this is by making it easy. So how do we make it easy? Well, every action that we do requires a specific amount of energy, and the more energy required, the less likely we are to do that specific action. As James describes, habits like scrolling on our phones, checking email and watching television steal so much of our time because they can be performed almost without effort. They are remarkably convenient. I mean, grabbing your phone and scrolling through Instagram doesn't require a lot of energy. Most of the time we perform a specific action because we want a specific outcome. For instance, we go to the gym because we want to become more fit. Now, going to the gym can be seen as an obstacle to getting fit. Or we read more because we want knowledge enhancement. Now, reading can be seen as an obstacle to getting more knowledge. So we don't want the actual habit itself, we want the specific outcome of that habit. In order to achieve things that pay off in the long run, we need to reduce as much friction as possible to perform that particular habit. Now, according to James, one of the most effective ways to reduce friction is by priming your environment. Or, in other words, by making cues more obvious. So, you want to read before going to bed? Then put the book you are currently reading on your pillow. Or you want to drink more water during your workday? Then place a bottle of water inside. Now, personally, if I want to work on my YouTube videos, I clean my desk the evening before. This makes it way easier for me to start. Now, another option to reduce friction is by making actions easier. For instance, you are more likely to go to the gym if it's on the same route through work. Habits are easier to build when they fit into the flow of your life. Now, another way to reduce friction is by using the 2-minute rule to stop procrastination. What this means is the following. When you start a new habit, it should take less than 2 minutes to do. Read before bed each night becomes read 1 page. Do 30 minutes of yoga becomes take out my yoga mat. Study for class becomes open my notes. Fold the laundry becomes fold 1 pair of socks. Run 3 miles becomes tie my running shoes. Now this is a great strategy because once you start doing the right thing, it is much easier to just continue doing it. As described by James,
the actions that follow can be challenging, but the first 2 minutes should be easy.
And of course, in the end, it is better to do less than you hoped than to do nothing at all. Alright, so the fourth law, make it satisfying. If an experience is not satisfying, we have little reason to repeat it. It is pretty simple. What is rewarded is repeated, what is punished is avoided. Now the first 3 laws of behavior change, make it obvious, make it attractive, and make it easy, increase the odds that a behavior will be performed. But this fourth law of behavior change, make it satisfying, increases the odds that a behavior will be repeated. So let's zoom in a bit deeper. The mismatch between immediate and delayed rewards. In modern society, many of the choices you make today will not benefit you immediately. For instance, if you exercise today, you may not be overweight next year. Or if you start working the first day of the month, you usually get your paycheck a couple of weeks later. But our brain evaluates rewards inconsistent across time. Now this basically means that you value the present more than the future.
For instance, we all know that smoking might kill you in the long run. But still many people smoke because it reduces stress and eases your nicotine cravings right now at this moment.
Now usually with our bad habits the immediate outcome feels good, but the ultimate outcome feels bad. Now with our good habits it is usually the other way around. The ultimate outcome feels unpleasant, but the outcome in the long run feels good. As described by James,
at some point, success in nearly every field requires you to ignore an immediate reward in favor of a delayed reward.
Now the best way to do this is to add a little bit of pleasure to your habits that pay off in the long run and a little bit of pain to your bad habits. So how do we do that? Well,
the vital thing in getting a habit to stick is to feel successful, even if it's in a small way. The feeling of success is a signal that your habit paid off and that the work was worth the effort. Now, as described by James, visual measures like moving paper clips, hairpins or marbles from one jar to the other after each time that you worked on an important task provide clear evidence of your progress. Visual measures like this add a little bit of immediate satisfaction to any activity. As described by James, perhaps the best way to measure your progress is with a habit tracker.
A habit tracker is a simple way to measure whether you did a habit.
For instance, crossing a task off your to-do list, or writing an X on your calendar when you did your workout. Research has shown that people who track their progress on goals like losing weight, quitting smoking, and lowering blood pressure are more likely to improve than those who don't. But no matter how consistent you are with your habits, it's inevitable that life will interrupt you at some point.
Therefore, James uses a very simple rule. Never miss twice. Missing once is an accident, missing twice is the start of a new habit. So it's crucial to show up if you don't feel like it, even if you do less than you hope. For instance, going to the gym for 5 minutes might not improve your performance, but it reaffirms your identity. Alright, so that were the most important lessons that I gathered from this book. I hope you liked the video and I see you in the next one.